Imagine a devoted father who moves across state lines just to be closer to his son, only to vanish into thin air 5 days later. His roommate claims he ran off with a mysterious woman he met online, but when detectives looked for her, they found absolutely nothing. No name, no face, and no digital footprint. What they found instead was a chilling secret hidden inside an empty bedroom and a suspect whose behavior was so bizarre it defies logic. You are about to see a case where the accused didn't just lead the police to the scene of the tragedy. He actually laughed while showing them exactly how he ended his best friend's life. This is a story of a digital ghost, a haunted road, and one of the most disturbing interrogations you will ever hear. But before we unravel this web of lies, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a deep dive into the unknown. Let's get into it. The silence was not just an absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating presence that grew heavier with each passing hour. For Kelly Simile, the silence coming from her son's phone was a loud, screaming alarm that no one else seemed to hear yet. It was August 2nd, 2020, a date that would mark the dividing line between her life before and the nightmare that was beginning to unfold. She stared at the device in her hand, willing it to light up, to vibrate, to show just one single notification from him. Christopher Sky Bowling, known to everyone who loved him simply as Chris, was not the kind of person to vanish. He was not the type of son who let days slip by without a check-in, and he was certainly not the type of father who would go silent on his child. That was the anchor of her fear, his devotion. A man who loves his child more than anything does not simply walk away into the void without a word. 5 days. It had been 5 long, agonizing days since she had last heard his voice. In the beginning, she had tried to rationalize it, fighting down the rising panic with logic that felt increasingly fragile. Maybe he was busy. Maybe his phone battery had died, and he could not find a charger. Maybe he was working a double shift and fell asleep the moment he got home. But as one day bled into 2, and 2 into 3, the excuses she invented began to crumble. This was out of character. This was wrong. Kelly paced the floor, her mind racing through every conversation they had shared recently, looking for a clue, a hint, a shadow of trouble she might have missed. There was nothing. He had been looking forward to his new chapter, to building a life closer to his son. He had moved to Myrtle Beach with a plan and a purpose. He was not running away from his life. He was running toward it. That simple fact made the silence terrifying. If he was not running, then something had stopped him. She dialed his number again. It was a ritual she had performed dozens of times over the last 120 hours. The call went straight to voicemail. That mechanical, recorded greeting was the only way she could hear his voice now. And each time it played, it felt less like a comfort and more like a ghost. She did not leave a message this time. She had already left so many, pleading, demanding, crying, and trying to sound calm. "This is not like him," she said aloud, the words breaking the quiet of the room. She needed to hear herself say it to make it real, to validate the intuition that was screaming in her gut. He would not just disappear without a trace. He just wouldn't. The fear was no longer a vague anxiety. It was a physical weight in her chest, making it hard to breathe. She knew, with the terrifying certainty that only a mother possesses, that someone was hurting him, or worse, that someone had already hurt him. The thought made her tremble, but it also steeled her resolve. She could not wait any longer. Waiting was passive. Waiting was hoping for a text that was clearly not coming. She had to act. She picked up the phone again, but this time she did not dial Chris. She punched in the numbers for the authorities. Her fingers were steady, driven by a desperate need for answers. When the line connected, she did not hesitate. She did not sound like a panicked woman making a fuss over nothing. She sounded like a mother who knew her child was in danger. "I need to report a missing person," she stated, her voice firm despite the tremor she felt inside. "My son, Christopher Sky Bowling." She explained the situation to the officer on the other end, recounting the timeline with precise detail. She told them about the 5 days of silence. She told them about his personality, how consistent and reliable he was. She emphasized that this behavior was completely alien to the man she raised. He was not a drifter. He was not irresponsible. He was a father, a son, a friend. This is not his personality, she insisted, needing the person on the other end to understand that this was not a misunderstanding or a case of a young man taking a spontaneous vacation. I am worried that he is hurt. I am worried that someone is hurting him because this is out of character for my son. The police took the information. They asked the standard questions: height, weight, last known location, who he was living with. She answered everything, her mind locking onto the image of his roommates. He was staying with a co-worker, a guy named Tyler, and some friends from back home had been visiting. They were the last people to see him. They were the connection. As she ended the call, the reality of what she had just done settled over her. By making it official, by opening a case file, she had acknowledged that the danger was real. She was no longer just a worried mother waiting by the phone. She was the mother of a missing person. The investigation would start now. The Myrtle Beach Police Department would launch their inquiry. They would go to his workplace. They would go to his apartment. They would ask the questions she could not ask. But even as she felt a flicker of relief that help was coming, the dread remained. The silence from his phone was still there, vast and unbroken. Kelly sat down, the phone still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. She knew that unraveling the truth of what happened in those 5 days might shatter her world completely. But she also knew she would not stop. She would not rest until that silence was broken, until she knew exactly why her son, who loved his life and his child, had suddenly ceased to exist in the world he cherished. The wait for the truth had begun. And deep down, beneath the hope she desperately clung to, a cold realization was taking root. Life, as she knew it, ended 5 days ago. Now, she was just fighting to find out how. The transition from a missing person report to an active investigation is often a shift in momentum, a change from passive waiting to calculated movement. For the detectives at the Myrtle Beach Police Department, the name Christopher Sky Bowling was no longer just an entry in a database. He was a priority. The timeline established by his mother was rigid and alarming. 5 days of silence from a devoted father was not a misunderstanding. It was a signal that something had disrupted the natural order of his life. To find the source of that disruption, the investigators knew they had to start at the center of his world in Myrtle Beach. They needed to speak to the person who saw him every day. They needed to find Tyler. Tyler Panzarella was more than just a name on a lease. He was the primary connection. He was the roommate, the co-worker, and the friend who had opened his door when Chris needed a place to stay. The investigators located Tyler quickly, knowing that in cases of disappearance, the people living under the same roof often hold the keys to the mystery, whether they realize it or not. The approach was standard. They were not storming in with accusations. They were simply asking questions, gathering the loose threads of a life that had suddenly unspooled. When the detectives engaged Tyler, the atmosphere was professional but probing. They needed to establish a baseline of truth. They asked him how long he had known Chris, trying to gauge the depth of their relationship. Tyler explained that their history was not particularly long, but it was significant enough that he had offered Chris a home. Chris had originally been living in Tennessee, but the pull of fatherhood was strong. He had reached out to Tyler a few months prior, searching for a temporary landing spot so he could be closer to his son. Tyler recounted the arrangement with a calm demeanor. He explained that Chris had been transparent about his intentions. He wanted a permanent residence nearby to be a present father, and he had offered to pay rent for the privilege of staying with Tyler until he could find an apartment of his own. Tyler had agreed, saying it was no problem to help a friend out. The logic held up. It painted a picture of Chris as responsible and family-oriented, a man making logistical moves to improve his life. But then, the narrative Tyler provided took a sharp, confusing turn. According to Tyler, the plan had changed abruptly. He told the investigators that Chris's friends, Bailey and Nick, had driven him down from Tennessee, and that the 3 of them had been staying at the apartment. It was a crowded house, but temporary. Then, Tyler dropped the explanation for Chris's absence, an explanation that seemed to clash violently with everything the mother had just reported. Tyler claimed that Chris had met a girl online. The story was simple, almost too simple. Tyler stated that Chris had become infatuated with this new acquaintance and had decided to leave everything behind to go to North Carolina to be with her. He told the detectives that the last time he heard from Chris was around the 26th or 27th of the month. After that, there was nothing. No phone calls, no messages, just a sudden departure for a new romance. The investigators listened intently, their faces neutral, but their minds were already dissecting the plausibility of this tale. Tyler claimed he had no idea what the girl's name was. He offered no specific details about who she was or where in North Carolina she lived. It was a vague, nebulous explanation, the kind of story that is easy to tell because it requires so few verifiable facts. He just kept talking about this girl, Tyler insisted, suggesting that Chris was so swept up in the moment that he abandoned his primary motivation for moving to Myrtle Beach in the first place. The detectives pressed him gently. Did he know anything else? Did Chris mention a last name? A city? A phone number? Tyler offered nothing concrete. He simply reiterated that Chris had gone to North Carolina and that the communication had ceased completely. The discrepancy was glaring. The investigators knew Chris had moved states specifically to be near his child. The idea that a dedicated father would uproot his life for his son, only to immediately abandon that goal for a stranger he met on the internet, rang false. It defied the psychological profile provided by Chris's family. Men who are focused on stability and parenting rarely run off on a whim with someone whose name their roommate does not even know. Tyler also mentioned that the other two guests, Bailey and Nick, had already returned to Tennessee shortly after Chris supposedly vanished. This information was crucial. It meant the witnesses were scattered. It meant Tyler was the only one left in Myrtle Beach to tell the story. The detectives took note of Tyler's helpfulness. He provided the phone numbers for Nick and Bailey when asked. He did not seem agitated. He did not seem evasive in his demeanor. He answered every question with a steady answer. But the answers themselves were the problem. They were convenient. They explained away the silence without offering a way to verify the safety of the missing man. As the conversation concluded, the investigators walked away with a story that felt constructed. The girl from North Carolina is a common trope in disappearances, a phantom figure used to explain why someone walked away. It is a narrative designed to make the police stop looking, to make them believe the missing person left of their own free will. But the detectives were not satisfied. They looked at the facts. A loving father, a sudden silence, a vague story about a mystery woman, and a roommate who seemed perfectly content with the idea that his friend had just walked off the face of the earth. The instinct that had driven Kelly Simile to call the police was now buzzing in the minds of the professionals. They knew they had to dig deeper. They knew they had to verify if this girl even existed, or if she was merely a ghost story invented to cover a much darker truth. The investigation was no longer just about finding Chris. It was about dismantling the story that was being told about him. The modern investigation is a war fought on two fronts. There is the physical world, where people speak and leave footprints, and then there is the digital world, a silent repository of secrets that rarely lies. The detectives in Myrtle Beach knew that while a person might be able to compose a convincing face-to-face narrative, the data they left behind was often far less forgiving. Tyler had provided a story, a reason for Christopher Skybolling's absence. But a story is merely words until it is supported by evidence. To verify Tyler's claims, the investigators first had to look toward Tennessee. Tyler had mentioned that Chris's friends, Nick and Bailey, had been present during the days leading up to the disappearance. If the story about the mysterious woman from North Carolina was true, these two witnesses would likely hold the corroborating details. The detectives reached out, attempting to bridge the distance between the states to find clarity. They failed to make contact with Bailey, but they were successful in reaching Nick. When they spoke to him, the detectives were looking for inconsistencies, for the small fractures that usually appear when two people try to tell the same lie. However, what they found was a mirror image. Nick repeated the narrative almost word for word. He, too, insisted that Chris had met a girl from North Carolina. He, too, claimed that Chris had skipped town to be with this newfound romantic interest, abandoning his previous plans. On the surface, this alignment should have strengthened Tyler's alibi. Two independent sources were telling the exact same story. But to a seasoned investigator, perfect symmetry is often more suspicious than chaos. Real memories are messy. They vary in perspective and detail. When two stories lock together with the precision of a script, it suggests rehearsal rather than recollection. The detectives noted the consistency, but instead of alleviating their suspicions, it deepened them. The narrative itself had a fundamental flaw, a psychological crack that no amount of repetition could seal. The detectives returned to the profile of the missing man. Chris was not a drifter. He was a father who had uprooted his existence specifically to be closer to his child. The idea that he would sever contact with his family and abandon his son for a stranger he met on the internet was incompatible with his character. Love causes people to do irrational things, but it rarely causes a devoted parent to vanish into a complete communication blackout. To settle the matter, the investigators turned to the unblinking eye of digital forensics. They obtained a search warrant for Chris's social media records and communication history. If Chris had been courting a woman online, there would be a trail. There would be messages, friend requests, likes, comments, or a digital exchange of affection. A relationship strong enough to prompt a sudden relocation does not materialize from thin air. It leaves a heavy footprint in the digital sand. The forensic team began their excavation of his digital life. They sifted through every interaction, looking for the girl from North Carolina. They looked for the plans to move. They looked for the excitement of a new romance. They found absolutely nothing. The data was stark and empty. There were no long message threads with a new partner. There were no searches for directions to North Carolina. There was no digital evidence that this woman even existed. The entire romantic subplot that Tyler and Nick had presented appeared to be a complete fabrication, a ghost story invented to explain away a physical absence. The silence in the data was deafening. It was a negative proof. The lack of evidence for the lie became the evidence of the deception. What the detectives did find was a snapshot of normalcy right before the silence descended. The last activity on Chris's account was a video he had posted on the day of his disappearance. It showed him sitting by a fire, relaxed, seemingly at peace. It was not the behavior of a man frantically packing to run away. It was the behavior of a man settling in. After that post, all activity ceased. There was no slow fade. There was just a sudden, violent stop. This abrupt digital termination confirmed the detective's darkest theory. Chris had not walked away. He had been stopped. The story about the girl was a diversion, a way to buy time and misdirect the police toward a destination that Chris never intended to visit. The realization crystallized the investigation. The focus shifted away from the phantom woman and snapped back to the people who had invented her. Tyler and Nick were no longer just helpful witnesses providing context. They were the authors of a fiction designed to cover a reality they did not want the police to see. The detectives knew that if the story was a lie, then the truth was likely something they were desperately trying to hide. With the digital alibi dismantled, the investigators knew they had to return to the physical world. They had to go back to the source. They applied for another warrant. But this time, they were not looking for data. They were looking for biological evidence. They were going back to the apartment, not to ask questions, but to let the science speak for itself. The time for stories was over. The investigation had reached a critical pivot point. The total absence of digital evidence regarding the mysterious woman from North Carolina had convinced the detectives that the story was a fabrication, a narrative shield constructed to deflect attention. If Christopher had not run away to start a new romance, then the reality of his absence was far darker. The investigators knew they had to return to the physical world, to the last place Christopher was known to be, to find the truth that the digital world could not provide. They secured a second search warrant for the apartment Tyler and Christopher shared. This time, however, they were not looking for packed bags, missing keys, or travel documents. They were looking for something invisible. To aid in this search, they brought in a specialized tool, a canine unit trained specifically for the detection of human remains. This animal possessed an olfactory acuity capable of identifying the chemical signatures of life lost, signatures that the human nose would never register. The team entered the residence with a focused intensity. They were not there to document the layout of the furniture or the condition of the household. Their eyes were fixed solely on the canine. The handler guided the dog through the common areas, moving methodically. The detectives watched in silence, waiting for a reaction, a shift in behavior that would signal a discovery. They moved through the living space, the tension in the air palpable as the animal worked the grid. When the canine entered the room that had been designated as Christopher's, the change was immediate. The dog, alerted, to the untrained eye, the movement might have seemed subtle, but to the handler and the detectives, it was a screaming siren. The dog had detected the scent it was trained to find, the undeniable presence of human remains. The investigators scanned the room. It was empty. There was no person there, no obvious sign of a fatal incident within those four walls. But the dog's alert was not a mistake. It indicated that the scent was present, lingering in the environment. The detectives quickly processed the implications of this finding. If the body was not there, but the scent was, it meant the evidence had been transported. The theory of transfer took hold. The detectives deduced that Tyler, or someone who had been in that room, had been in close proximity to the remains at another location. Forensic traces from the scene had likely adhered to their footwear or clothing. When that person returned to the apartment, they had unknowingly walked the evidence right through the front door and into the bedroom, leaving a biological footprint that only the dog could perceive. This discovery fundamentally altered the landscape of the case. It was no longer a missing person investigation based on a suspicious story. It was now a homicide inquiry supported by forensic science. The girl from North Carolina was effectively erased from the board. In her place stood the stark reality that the suspect had been in contact with the deceased. The dog's alert was the silent witness the detectives needed. It linked the apartment to a crime scene that existed somewhere out in the world, a location they had yet to find but now knew for certain existed. The investigators withdrew from the apartment, the weight of the discovery settling upon them. They had what they needed. The scent was the lever that would pry the truth from the silence. They knew that when they spoke to Tyler again, it would not be a casual conversation about a roommate who moved out. It would be a confrontation about why the scent of his friend's death had followed him home. 6 days after the forensic search had silently altered the trajectory of the investigation, the detectives returned to the source. They did not come with sirens or a tactical team. They arrived with a calculated calmness. The goal was not to drag Tyler out in handcuffs just yet, but to invite him into a conversation that he would believe he could control. They found him at his apartment, the very place where the canine unit had signaled the presence of a tragedy, and asked to speak with him again. The initial approach was disarmingly casual. The detectives introduced themselves, maintaining a tone that was almost apologetic for the intrusion. They framed their presence as a procedural necessity, explaining that they were simply assisting the missing persons division with a few loose ends. This was a strategic deception, a way to lower the suspect's defenses by making him feel like a witness rather than a target. They wanted Tyler to feel comfortable, to believe that he was still the narrator of this story. However, once the pleasantries were exchanged, the tone shifted perceptibly. The detective looked at Tyler and leaned in, signaling that the conversation was moving from general inquiries to specific accusations. He told Tyler that at this point, they believed something significant had happened to Chris. They were no longer operating under the assumption that he had run off to North Carolina. They stated clearly that they were talking to Tyler because he was one of the last people to see the missing man alive. Then, the detective offered an olive branch, a psychological lifeline commonly used to induce a confession. He suggested that perhaps the event was an accident. He told Tyler that they suspected he knew something about it, but framed it in a way that allowed for a mistake rather than a malicious act. By offering the narrative of an accident, the investigator was giving Tyler a way to admit to the event without immediately branding himself a monster. It was a test to see if Tyler would grasp at the opportunity to minimize his guilt. But the detectives did not rely solely on psychological manipulation. They needed to show their hand to make Tyler realize the walls were closing in. The detective informed Tyler directly about the search warrant they had executed previously. He told him about the cadaver dog. He explained, with clinical precision, that the specialized animal had alerted to the presence of a deceased person inside the apartment. Tyler's reaction to this revelation was telling. A truly innocent person, upon hearing that a cadaver dog found the scent of death in their roommate's room, would likely express shock, horror, or concern for their friend. Tyler did none of those things. Instead, his mind went immediately to the mechanics of the search. He asked the detectives where exactly the dog had alerted, inquiring if it was a specific spot or just a general area. It was the response of a man trying to calculate how much evidence had been exposed, rather than a man grieving a loss. The detective cut through the deflection. He told Tyler he was not there to play games. He explained that he was giving Tyler every opportunity to provide additional information before the investigation moved past the point of no return. The message was clear. Right now, they were having a conversation, but soon they would be putting the puzzle together on their own. "We need to know now," the detective insisted, warning him that later on, when the full picture was assembled, this conversation would no longer be an option. The implication hung heavy in the air. This was the moment for Tyler to shape the narrative. If he stayed silent, the evidence, the dog, the lack of digital footprints, the inconsistencies would speak for him, and the story the evidence was telling was one of guilt. Tyler sat in the tension of that ultimatum. The girl from North Carolina was gone. The silence was broken. The police knew about the scent. He had to make a choice: continue to deny the undeniable, or spin a new story that might save him from the full weight of the consequences. The detectives waited, watching his eyes, knowing that the shift was coming. The alibi had collapsed. Now, the bargaining would begin. The moment the detectives placed the reality of the forensic evidence on the table, the air in the room changed. The phantom woman from North Carolina, the convenient excuse of a sudden romance, and the story of a voluntary departure all evaporated under the heat of the canine unit's discovery. Tyler sat across from the investigators, the silence stretching thin. He was intelligent enough to understand that continuing to deny that Christopher was gone would only insult the intelligence of the men sitting across from him. The police knew death had visited the apartment. The only question left was how it had arrived. Tyler realized he needed a new narrative. If he could not deny the event, he had to deny the intent. He had to distance himself from the role of the aggressor and reposition himself as a victim of circumstance. He looked at the detectives, his demeanor shifting from casual cooperation to a performance of reluctance and fear. The detectives, sensing the dam was about to break, opened a door for him. They asked if he believed that the other men who had been visiting Nick or Bailey were capable of doing something terrible to Christopher. This was the exit Tyler needed. He seized upon the name of his friend, Nick. Tyler leaned in, his voice dropping as if he were finally sharing a secret he had been too terrified to speak aloud. He told the investigators that Nick scared him. He described Nick not as a friend, but as a volatile presence, someone who carried himself in a way that intimidated those around him. Tyler claimed that Nick had been making strange comments, alluding to past acts of violence that had deeply unsettled him. He painted a picture of a man who boasted about having taken a life before, a confession that Tyler claimed had scared the life out of him. By casting Nick as the villain, Tyler was attempting to explain his own silence. He was suggesting that his failure to report the disappearance was not due to guilt, but due to paralyzing fear of a dangerous associate. The detectives listened, their faces neutral masks of professional interest. They asked what Nick had told him. Tyler introduced a specific location into the narrative, a detail that grounded his new story in local folklore. He asked the detectives if they knew about the old haunted road, Lucas Road. He explained that the group had not gone into the woods to commit a crime, they had gone there for an adventure. The premise was innocent, juvenile even. They were just friends looking for a thrill, heading to a notorious spot to see if the ghost stories were true. According to Tyler, the drive to the woods was driven by this curiosity. He, Nick, Bailey, and Christopher had all gone together. But once they arrived at the isolated location, the dynamic shifted. Tyler admitted that a weapon was involved, a firearm that belonged to him. However, in this version of events, he was not the one who wielded it. Tyler spun a tale where Nick, the erratic and frightening figure, took control of the situation. He claimed that Nick had asked for the weapon, or had taken it, and then, without warning or provocation, had used it on Christopher. Tyler described the moment as sudden and shocking. One minute they were walking through the dark, looking for ghosts, and the next, Christopher was gone. "I was shaking, scared for my life," Tyler told the investigators. He described a state of absolute terror, claiming he did not know if he was going to be the next target. He portrayed himself as a helpless bystander, frozen in the face of Nick's brutality. He insisted that he had no part in the planning, no desire for the outcome, and no power to stop it. The narrative was a classic example of minimization. Tyler had conceded the most damaging fact that Christopher was dead and that he was present when it happened, but he had stripped himself of all agency. In his story, he was just a passenger in his own car, a spectator to his own gun being used, and a victim of his friend's madness. He claimed he stayed silent for a month, not because he was covering up his own crime, but because he was traumatized and terrified of what Nick might do to him if he spoke. The detectives absorbed the story. It was a significant breakthrough. They finally had an admission that Christopher had been killed and a location for where the body might be found. However, they also noted the detachment in Tyler's delivery. He spoke of being scared for his life, yet his recounting of the event lacked the visceral emotion one would expect from someone who had watched a friend die. There were no tears, no panic, just a flat recitation of a sequence of events that conveniently absolved him of all blame. The investigators did not challenge him immediately. They needed the location. They needed to find Christopher. If Tyler wanted to play the role of the frightened witness to lead them to the truth, they would let him play it for now. But as they prepared to move the investigation from the interview room to the field, they knew that placing the blame on the man in Tennessee was a strategy that would need to be tested against the hard evidence of the crime scene. The story of the haunted road had given them a map, but it had not given them the full truth. The interrogation room, usually a place of static conversation, transformed into a stage for a disturbing performance. The detectives needed more than just a verbal account of the events on the haunted road. They needed to see the mechanics of the tragedy. Words allow for ambiguity, but physical actions require specificity. If Tyler was telling the truth that he was a terrified bystander watching a friend commit a horrific act, his body language should mirror that memory. It should reflect the trauma, the hesitation, and the paralyzing fear he claimed to have felt. The investigators asked Tyler to demonstrate exactly how the event unfolded. They wanted to know where everyone was standing, how the weapon was transferred, and the precise moment the life was taken. Tyler agreed, standing up to act out the final moments of Christopher's life. He positioned himself, estimating the distance between the individuals involved. He described the group walking into the woods, the darkness surrounding them, and the sudden request from Nick to see the firearm. According to Tyler, Nick had asked to hold the weapon simply to discharge it into the air or at a tree, a casual request in the middle of an isolated location. Tyler claimed he complied without hesitation, handing over the instrument of death to the man he now claimed was a volatile killer. Then, Tyler extended his arm, mimicking the motion of the weapon being raised. He estimated the distance was close, perhaps 6 feet or less. It was in this moment, as Tyler pantomimed the fatal action, that the facade of the grieving, terrified friend shattered completely. As he demonstrated the moment the weapon was fired, a sound escaped him that chilled the detectives to the bone. Tyler laughed. It was not a sob of hysteria or a nervous release of tension. It was a chuckle, a light, almost amused sound that accompanied the reenactment of his roommate's death. The detectives watched, stunned by the incongruity. Tyler had just described the most traumatic moment of his life, a moment where he claimed to be shaking with fear, yet his face held a blank, detached stare, and his voice carried the levity of a bad joke. To the investigators, this was a massive psychological tell. While some might argue that laughter can be a defense mechanism in uncomfortable situations, the context here made that explanation nearly impossible to accept. Tyler was not just recounting a story. He was physically replaying the motion of ending a life. The laughter suggested a disturbing possibility. He was not recoiling from the memory. He was reliving it. The lack of empathy, the absence of horror, and the presence of amusement pointed toward a gratification that a truly innocent witness would never feel. The demonstration continued, revealing even more logical fractures in Tyler's story. He claimed that immediately after the weapon was discharged, Nick simply fell silent and handed the firearm back to him. This detail defied all tactical and psychological logic. If Nick was the aggressor who had just eliminated one person, why would he immediately disarm himself and hand the weapon back to the only witness left standing? By giving the gun back to Tyler, Nick would have been surrendering all control of the situation. Tyler claimed that he took the weapon back and then, inexplicably, followed Nick back to the car. He did not run. He did not use the weapon to defend himself or detain the man who had just attacked their friend. He simply got back into the vehicle with the killer and drove home. The narrative was collapsing under its own weight. Tyler's actions, the laughter, the calm demonstration, the illogical sequence of the weapon transfer were not those of a victim. They were the actions of someone who felt in control, someone who was not afraid of the outcome because he had orchestrated it. The detectives let him finish his performance. They had seen enough. The laughter had echoed louder than any confession. They knew now that they were not dealing with a man paralyzed by fear. They were dealing with a man who found amusement in the macabre. The reenactment had not proven his innocence. It had unveiled his nature. Now, they needed to see the final piece of this tragic puzzle. They needed him to take them to the woods, not as a guide, but as the author of the crime returning to the scene. The interrogation room had served its purpose. The theoretical phase of the investigation, the stories, the alibis, and the disturbing reenactments was over. Now, the detectives needed to bridge the gap between Tyler's words and the physical reality of the crime. Tyler had admitted that Christopher was no longer alive and had indicated that his remains were left in a specific, isolated location. The time had come to verify if this final admission was the truth or yet another layer of manipulation. The detectives made a strategic decision regarding Tyler's legal status. While the confession of being present at a homicide was damning, they chose to arrest him initially for obstruction of justice. This charge was grounded in the undeniable fact that he had misled the investigation for over a month, providing false leads about a woman in North Carolina and withholding critical information about the disappearance. This tactical move allowed them to keep him in custody and under their control while they transitioned the investigation from the police station to the field, without immediately showing their full hand regarding a murder charge. Tyler was escorted from the building and placed into a police vehicle. The dynamic had shifted once again. He was no longer a voluntary witness, helping with a missing person case. He was a detainee in shackles, guiding the authorities to the evidence of his own involvement. The atmosphere within the vehicle was heavy with unspoken tension. The detectives were no longer asking him if something had happened. They were relying on him to show them where the result of that event was hidden. As they began the drive, Tyler assumed the role of navigator. He directed the team away from the populated areas of Myrtle Beach and toward the outskirts, specifically guiding them to Gilbert Road, a route he noted was formerly known as Lucas Bay Road. The specificity of his directions stood in stark contrast to the vague, stumbling answers he had given earlier about the mystery girl. It was clear that while he had no memory of the fictitious romance, the geography of this location was etched deeply into his mind. The journey took them further away from civilization and deep into the quiet isolation of the county. For the detectives, every mile traveled was a confirmation that the initial reports of a runaway were tragic fictions. For Tyler, the drive was a return to the last place he had seen his friend alive. Yet, even in this confined space, with the gravity of the situation pressing down on them, Tyler remained composed. He offered instructions on where to turn and when to stop, treating the excursion with the practicality of a mundane errand rather than a grim procession to a crime scene. Eventually, the vehicle came to a halt. Tyler indicated that they had reached the vicinity. The location was remote, a place one would not stumble upon by accident. It was a fenced-off area, shielded from the road and the eyes of the public. The isolation was absolute. It was the kind of place chosen not for adventure, as Tyler had claimed, but for concealment. The detectives prepared to exit the vehicle. They had to manage the logistics of moving a detained suspect through difficult terrain. There was a discussion about the restraints, ensuring Tyler could move safely enough to guide them while remaining secure. The focus remained entirely on the procedure and the objective. They were close. The long month of silence, of wondering where Christopher Skybowling had gone, was about to end. Tyler had brought them to the edge of the woods, and now he would have to lead them into the brush to reveal what had been left behind in the darkness. The vehicle had stopped, but the investigation was still moving forward, pushing into the dense, untamed reality of the woods. Tyler, still restrained, stood as the temporary architect of the search. He did not recoil from the environment. Instead, he offered specific navigational cues, directing the detective's attention toward a particular section of the brush. When asked to clarify the location, he used the precision of a clock face, indicating a direction between 1 and 2 o'clock relative to their position. This specific guidance stripped away any lingering doubt that he might be guessing. He knew exactly where the timeline of his friend's life had ended. The detectives signaled for the support team to advance. A group of officers prepared to breach the thick vegetation, their movements deliberate and cautious. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery operation, and every step carried the risk of disturbing vital evidence. The lead investigator issued a warning to the team to be careful where they stepped, reminding them that the ground beneath their feet was now a crime scene. The tension was not in what they might find, but in the obligation to treat the discovery with the procedural respect it demanded. As the team disappeared into the overgrowth, the detective remaining with Tyler asked a specific question, one designed to link the memory of the living man to the discovery they were about to make. He asked Tyler what kind of footwear Christopher had been wearing on that final night. Tyler answered immediately, recalling the details without hesitation. Blue and white Jordans. It was a small, mundane detail, yet it served as a grim anchor, connecting the person missing for over a month to the physical evidence lying in the woods. The search team did not have to travel far. Approximately 50 feet into the brush, the movement stopped. The signal was given. They had found what they were looking for. There was no need for further directions from the man by the car. The silence of the woods was replaced by the somber activity of securing a perimeter. The discovery was made, confirming that the story of the girl from North Carolina and the trip to the haunted road were merely narrative paths leading to this singular, tragic destination. The identification of the remains would not be immediate. Due to the significant amount of time that had passed, visual identification was not possible. The authorities would later rely on dental records to provide the official scientific confirmation that the individual found in the woods was indeed Christopher Skybowling. However, for the detectives standing on Gilbert Road, the certainty was already absolute. The specific location, the proximity to the road Tyler identified, and the description of the clothing all aligned perfectly with the tragic reality before them. Tyler was not forced to confront the physical reality of the discovery up close. Once the location was verified, his role as a guide was finished. He was escorted back to the police cruiser, his utility to the search exhausted. He sat in the back of the vehicle, separated from the scene by glass and metal, while the forensic team began the long, difficult work of processing the site. The detectives looked at the young man who had led them there, noting once again the disconnect between his calm demeanor and the devastation lying just 50 feet away. The recovery of the remains marked the end of the mystery, but the beginning of the legal reckoning. The missing person status was formally revoked. The investigation had now transitioned fully into a homicide inquiry. The detectives knew that finding Christopher was only the first half of the equation. Now, they had to prove exactly who was responsible for leaving him there. Tyler had led them to the body, but he had also led them to believe he was a helpless victim of another man's violence. With the physical evidence now in custody, the detectives were ready to test that story against the weight of the law. They turned the car around, leaving the woods behind, and headed back to the interrogation room to finish what they had started. The transition from the open air of Gilbert Road back to the confines of the police department marked a definitive shift in the status of Tyler Panzarella. He was no longer a cooperating witness, helping to locate a missing person. He was the primary suspect in a homicide investigation. The detectives escorted him back into the interview room, the same space where he had previously spun tales of a runaway romance, but the dynamic had fundamentally hardened. The air was no longer filled with the pretense of a friendly inquiry. The time for patience had expired. Tyler, perhaps sensing that the walls were closing in, attempted a preemptive strike. In a moment of calculated desperation, he told the detectives that he had just spoken to the people in Tennessee. He claimed that there was a young man there who was already pinning the blame on him, asserting that the friends were framing him for the crime. It was a bold lie, designed to paint himself as the victim of a conspiracy before the police could even bring up the other suspects. However, the detectives saw through the fabrication immediately. They knew something Tyler did not. The investigators had not yet interviewed the friends, Nick and Bailey. In fact, both men were still hundreds of miles away in Tennessee, hours from being questioned. Tyler's claim that they were currently blaming him was a factual impossibility, a lie that revealed his anxiety and his awareness of his own guilt. The detectives used this to their advantage, deciding to test how far Tyler would go to defend his innocence against these imaginary accusations. The lead detective leaned in, adopting a tone of confrontation. He told Tyler that the friends were indeed saying he planned the entire event. He posited that the narrative coming from the others was that Tyler drove them out there, Tyler brought the weapon, and Tyler was the one who walked into the woods and pulled the trigger. It was a bluff, a reflection of the truth the detectives suspected, thrown back at the suspect to see if he would crack. Tyler denied it vehemently. He reverted to his persona of the good guy, insisting that he had never had a problem with Christopher, that he came from a good family, and that he would never do such a thing to another human being. He pleaded with the detectives to believe in his character, repeating that he was a good person who had simply found himself in a terrifying situation. The detective was unmoved. He asked the question that cut through the character defense. If Tyler was such a good person, why did he not call for emergency services? Why did he leave his roommate out in the woods alone, rather than seeking help? Tyler's response was a repetition of his previous excuse. He was scared, he did not know what to do, and he had never been in a situation like that before. The back and forth continued, with Tyler positioning himself as a defenseless victim of Nick's alleged volatility. He claimed Nick had the weapon and that Nick terrified him. Up until this point, the primary detective had played the role of the listener, the good cop willing to hear Tyler out. But the investigation needed a hammer to break the stalemate. It was time for a change in tactic. Sergeant Lent entered the room. His presence signaled the end of the negotiation phase. He did not sit down to have a conversation. He stood to deliver a reality check. He told Tyler that he had been sitting in another room, listening to every word of the story, and he was not buying a single sentence of it. The sergeant dismantled the good person defense with a few sharp questions. He asked Tyler his age and his plans for life, only to cut him off with the brutal truth. Tyler was preparing to go to prison. The sergeant's approach was direct and overwhelming. He demanded that Tyler look at him and stop with the crocodile tears. He stripped away the haunted road narrative, pointing out the inherent logic flaw in Tyler's story. He stated plainly that a person does not drive out to a remote location like Lucas Bay and bring a firearm into the dark woods at night unless they have a plan. The weapon was not an accessory for a ghost hunt. It was a tool for a specific purpose. The interrogation intensified as the sergeant attacked the moral void in Tyler's actions. He mocked the idea that Tyler didn't know what to do. He told Tyler that good people might make mistakes, but good people do not leave a friend lying alone in the woods without calling for help. That act alone, he argued, proved that Tyler was involved in something far more sinister than a mere accident. Despite the intense pressure and the overwhelming logic presented by the sergeant, Tyler refused to confess to the fatal act. He clung to his version of events, admitting only that he made a mistake by not coming forward sooner. He acknowledged that he should have called the police, and that he would have to live with the guilt of that silence. But he would not say the words the detectives wanted to hear. He maintained that he was the observer, not the executioner. The detectives realized that Tyler had no intention of taking full responsibility. His psychological walls were battered but still standing. However, they had enough. The discovery of the remains, the inconsistencies in his story, the lies about the friends in Tennessee, and his admission of being present at the scene provided sufficient grounds to move forward. They did not need a signed confession to know who was responsible. The decision was made to charge Tyler Panzarella with the murder of Christopher Skybowling and the possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. The interrogation room had failed to elicit the full truth from his lips, but his actions had already spoken loudly enough to seal his fate. With Tyler in custody and the physical evidence secured, the investigation faced a critical narrative divergence. Tyler had admitted to being present at the scene but had cast himself as a terrified witness to a crime committed by his friend, Nick. The detectives knew that to secure a conviction, they could not simply rely on Tyler's word. They needed to hear the story from the other side. The investigation expanded its reach beyond South Carolina, coordinating with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to locate the other two men who had been in that car on Gilbert Road. The authorities tracked down Nick and brought him into an office for questioning. The contrast between this interview and the one with Tyler was immediately stark. While Tyler had been strangely calm, cracking jokes and laughing during a reenactment of a fatality, Nick was visibly unraveling. He was emotional, anxious, and appeared to be carrying the heavy weight of the situation on his shoulders. However, investigators remained skeptical. They knew that Nick had possessed over a month to prepare a story, and excessive emotion can sometimes be a calculated performance to garner sympathy. The detectives from Horry County sat down with Nick and began to dismantle the timeline of July 27th. They assured him that his family was safe, a specific concern Nick raised regarding threats he claimed Tyler had made, and asked him to detail the night of the disappearance. Once reassured, Nick began to speak, and the story he told mirrored the geography of Tyler's account, but completely inverted the roles of the aggressor and the victim. According to Nick, the tension began in the car. He described a situation where Chris and Tyler were exchanging words, with Tyler making fun of Chris regarding his family. Nick claimed that Tyler seemed to reach a breaking point, describing it as the last straw. The drive to the woods was not a mutual adventure in Nick's version, but a confusing and terrifying ride into the unknown. He recalled the group walking into the dark forest, claiming that Tyler was the one leading them, talking about the haunted legends, while everyone else was freaking out. Nick's description of the final moments was filled with fear, but unlike Tyler, he claimed he was the one terrified of the man with the weapon. He described a scene of confusion where he did not know if he was going to be the next target. He insisted that he had never seen anything like it before and simply froze, not knowing how to react to the sudden violence unfolding in front of him. The detectives noted that Nick's emotional state seemed to align perfectly with the terrified feelings he was describing, a consistency that had been entirely absent in Tyler's detached recounting. Despite Nick's convincing demeanor, the detectives needed to apply pressure to ensure he was not hiding his own culpability. It was still one man's word against another's. To test Nick's resolve, the investigators utilized the most powerful tool they had acquired earlier that day, the visual reality of the crime scene. They presented Nick with crime scene photographs from the woods, forcing him to confront the grim finality of what had happened to his best friend. The reaction was visceral. Nick recoiled from the images, his distress escalating into a panic. He questioned what he was looking at, his voice breaking as he processed the sight of the tragedy. The detectives pressed him hard, asking, "Who did that?" and accusing the group collectively to see if he would crack. Nick's denial was immediate and vehement. He swore on everything he held sacred that he did not do it, pleading with the officers to believe him. He cried out that he never wanted any of this to happen to Chris. He lamented the bitter irony of the situation. He was the one who had driven Chris down to South Carolina to see his child, a gesture of friendship that had ended in absolute disaster. "It is not my fault," he repeated over and over, trying to distance himself from the act itself, even though he could not distance himself from the location. The investigators asked him to assign responsibility for the event on a scale of 0 to 100. Nick did not hesitate. He assigned 100% of the blame to Tyler. He insisted that Tyler was the one who had the plan, the weapon, and the intent. When asked about his own responsibility, Nick faltered, admitting that perhaps he bore a small percentage of blame simply for being there and not being able to stop it, but he maintained that he was powerless because he believed Tyler would have turned the weapon on him next. This interrogation fortified the case against Tyler. Nick's story was more detailed, his emotions appeared genuine, and his reaction to the evidence suggested horror rather than the gratification Tyler had seemed to display. However, the police were thorough. They had two conflicting stories, and to be absolutely certain, they needed a tiebreaker. They needed the third man. Bailey was the final piece of the puzzle. He was the only person present who had not been directly accused by the others as the shooter. To the detectives, he represented the neutral ground, the observer who could tip the scales of justice. They brought him in and laid the situation out clearly. They knew he was there, and they knew what had happened, but they needed him to cooperate, to save himself from being pulled down by his friend's actions. The detective asked the ultimate question: who pulled the trigger? Was it Tyler or was it Nick? Bailey's answer was concise and devoid of hesitation. He stated clearly that Tyler pulled out the weapon and fired. He confirmed it was a single shot. When the detectives probed further, suggesting that other people had named Nick as the shooter to see if Bailey would waver, he stood firm. He told them that just because Nick was his friend did not mean he would lie for him. But in this case, the truth was that Nick was innocent of the fatal act. To further validate his testimony, the detectives asked Bailey if he would be willing to submit to a polygraph examination. Bailey agreed immediately. While the results of such tests are not always admissible in court due to their reliability issues, his willingness to take one was a strong indicator of his transparency. The test results indicated no deception. Furthermore, Bailey provided a hand-drawn diagram of the crime scene, marking where the car was parked and where each person was standing. His sketch matched the physical evidence found by the police. With Bailey's corroborating testimony, the triangle was complete. Two witnesses independently identified Tyler as the perpetrator. The physical evidence was linked to Tyler's apartment. Tyler's own behavior, the laughter, the lies about the girl in North Carolina, and the calm demeanor painted a portrait of guilt. Bailey was determined to be an innocent bystander and was released, his role in the investigation serving as the final lock on the case against Tyler. The investigation that began with a mother's intuition had culminated in a definitive charge. Tyler Panzarella was formally accused of murder and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. The evidence against him was a fortress built from forensic alerts, witness testimony, and his own inconsistent statements. For the family of Christopher Sky Bowling, the arrest brought a measure of relief, but it also brought the shock of betrayal. Christopher's mother, Kelly, had to process the reality that the person responsible for ending her son's life was not a stranger, but a roommate and co-worker her son had trusted. Even more painful was the involvement of the friends from home, people Chris had called brothers, even if they had not pulled the trigger. The legal process moved slowly, as it often does. Tyler remained behind bars, maintaining his innocence throughout the proceedings. It was not until 2 years after his arrest that the case reached its conclusion. Tyler entered an Alford plea to the charge of voluntary manslaughter. This specific legal plea allowed him to maintain his assertion of innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution possessed enough evidence to likely secure a conviction from a jury. It was a final act of self-preservation, a way to accept the punishment without ever saying the words, "I did it." The judge sentenced Tyler to 20 years in prison. Under the terms of the sentence, he is required to serve 85% of that time before becoming eligible for supervised release. To this day, the exact motive what specifically caused him to snap in that car or on that road remains a muddy mixture of minor grievances and irrational violence. As for Nick, his initial deception cost him. Because he had lied to investigators during the first phone interview about Chris's whereabouts, claiming he had gone to North Carolina, he was charged with obstruction of justice. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 10 years of probation. It was a lighter sentence, reflecting that while he was not the killer, his silence had delayed the truth. The closing of a case file rarely means the closing of the emotional wound for the family left behind. Kelly Simmerly, Christopher's mother, found herself grappling with a loss that defied explanation. She described her son as her best friend, a presence that was woven into the fabric of her daily life. The justice system had done its job. The person responsible was incarcerated, and the truth had been uncovered. Yet, the question of why lingered a cruel, unanswerable echo. Kelly spoke of her faith, noting that she did not blame the divine for what happened, but she struggled to understand the senselessness of it all. Why did a young father, moving to be closer to his son, have to cross paths with such darkness? The cruelty of the act, the way he was left alone in the woods by people he trusted, was a pain that no court sentence could alleviate. However, Kelly refused to let the darkness of Gilbert Road be the final memory of her son. She chose to focus on the light he brought into the world, rather than the way he was taken out of it. In a lasting tribute to his spirit, she named a star after Chris. It was a symbolic gesture, a way to ensure that even though he was gone from the earth, his presence would remain a constant, shining light in the darkness, watching over the son he loved so much. The silence that began on August 2nd was finally broken by the truth, but the story of Christopher Sky Bowling serves as a haunting reminder of how quickly a life can be altered by the people we choose to trust. See you next time.